welcome to another episode of Roll or Die. We're taking a little bit of a tangent in this week's episode. We've previously done one very similar. So we have for you today, he is a BJJ brown belt at Absolute MMA, and he is a sports therapist and researcher. Here to cover all things jiu-jitsu, exercise, injury, prevention, etc. related. Welcome, Tim Trevail. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, Kim. Looking forward to the chat.
Awesome. Well, actually, I know, Tim, I know we're going to go right down that path. You're going to be best at asking those questions, Kim. But Tim, I've seen you compete a lot, man. Like in my journey of, the Arnold Classics and comps like that. I just always seem to see you compete a lot, man. And you're an absolute murderer out there. Is that is that the way you've always been in BJJ? Let's start with that. Let's start with your competition approach. Is it because you can piece yourself back together when you make a mistake and rehab yourself? What is it?
Yeah, that Arnold Classic's going back a bit. Gee, I think we were white belts back then, back in that'd been sort of 2012, 13, something like that, a little while ago now. But I've always definitely been competitive in anything I've done. And I've got a background in Japanese jiu-jitsu, funnily enough, in I was looking for a tennis club or something like that at university and ended up falling into this sort of funny jiu-jitsu thing that I stayed with for a while, and then realized I liked the groundwork stuff and always been competitive, and definitely competed a lot when I went to sort of Worlds and Pan Ams and a few of the Absolute guys back, I suppose heavily up to purple belt, and then in the gi and no gi up till about purple belt, and then sort of dropped the gi as many of us did when Craig and Lockie were training for the EBIs, and really got kind of wrapped up in all of that stuff and really enjoyed that. I suppose the last few years, to my detriment somewhat, I've kind of probably competed a bit less. I was picked up a PhD and children and stuff like that have all put into it. But this year I'm planning to get back onto the competition mats, and already entered a couple for later in the year. So I'm really excited to get back to that.
Awesome, man. I can't wait to see that.
And so tell us about your journey then onto the jiu-jitsu mat. You mentioned Japanese jiu-jitsu. How did you discover jiu-jitsu? And then how long have you been in Australia? When did you get here?
Yeah, I come over here. I was working for a university in the UK for about 5 years and decided to have a sabbatical. Left for about a year, and that was about 11 years ago. Came out to Melbourne for a year and got stuck for 11 so far. And so as soon as I came out here, I knew that that's pretty much when I started my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu journey. I knew that I sort of enjoyed the groundwork style of stuff. I think I'd had 2 classes. Well, I didn't know who he was at the time, but my first class was with Braulio Estima in Birmingham in the UK.
Wow.
But I didn't know who he was. But looking back, it's a good introduction to it. And then coming out here, trained with Dominance for a few years over at those guys, and then started to compete with some of the guys at Absolute. Got to know some of those, and then came over to Absolute sort of as a new blue belt a little while ago, and just been enjoying the journey. And I'm just really fortunate that I can marry up my passions for jiu-jitsu with my passions for rehab and all things sports injuries. Really,
that's awesome.
You mean you injure them and then you put them back together? Is that what you mean?
Pretty much. Isn't that the original sort of philosophers were the healers as well as the martial artists back in the day?
Yes.
So knowing how to break things is very similar to knowing how to fix things.
Yeah. I like it. But what was the link? Like when you came here and you were doing Japanese jiu-jitsu, you done one BJJ class. What made you move to BJJ away from the Japanese jiu-jitsu? What was the motivation there?
I think I just realized some of the bullshit around Japanese jiu-jitsu, to be honest. Some of it's really useful, and I was actually wrist locking someone from standing today, because I've been wrestling a lot recently, and I was actually wrist locking someone from standing, and that's from those old Japanese jiu-jitsu days. But there's just a lot of kind of ponce around it, and a lot of kind of pretense of 2 people aren't really trying to hurt each other. One person's pretending to throw a punch and the other person's defending that. Whereas when you kind of start to do a little bit of the groundwork and play around with that, and you realize that the only true sort of honesty in martial arts is when 2 people are both having a at each other. And so any martial arts that doesn't have two people trying to make an equal against each other, in my opinion, is just sort of leaving a bit out there, and just doesn't probably represent reality. So that's kind of, I wish I got started into, when I got started in Japanese jiu-jitsu, but that is the way. We all have our different journeys, and it probably added a bit to my jiu-jitsu anyway.
Awesome.
And so, Tim, so you're a sports therapist. Like, I guess that's sort of all encompassing, yeah, because it is a bit confusing. There's a few different, you've got your physio, chiro, osteo, myo. Like, yeah. What's the difference with them and what you do, and like just give us a bit of an overview of that.
It's certainly confusing out there, and it's confusing for many people in the industry, let alone people that are just looking for the right person to fix their injury or to get them back on the mats. So in the UK, the healthcare system is a little bit different. It's mainly probably physio dominant, but there's a large number of what's called sports therapists, so physio in their undergrad practice would do a combination of the musculoskeletal stuff, but then they also do the cardiac, the pulmonary, the post-surgical care, a lot of other stuff, not just musculoskeletal injuries. Whereas in the UK, there's a specialization called sports therapy, which just looks at musculoskeletal injuries, but very much from the original injury right through to getting back to sport-specific training. And you've got some fantastic physios and chiros and everything else out there that do that later stage stuff, but there's more embedded in the undergraduate training in the UK in terms of that kind of sport-specific stuff, because there's more room for it, because we're not designed to work in hospitals like physios are in their undergrad. So there's just more space to look at strength and conditioning principles as well as the musculoskeletal stuff. So we combine that together really well, I think, as sports therapists. I work in a clinic that's very much it's about 8 or 10 physios and myself as a sports therapist. But my full-time role is actually working for a university. So I work sort of full-time Monday to Friday in academic management, academic leadership, running some courses, including an undergraduate program in myotherapy, a degree program. So I'm very familiar with those sort of different areas, and worked and taught, and have a role also at Monash University in their physiotherapy sort of program over there, where I do a bit of research. I suppose, long story short, if you look at someone 5 years postgraduately or 10 years postgraduately, you look at the way they practice, if they're good and they're evidence-based and they've been following the research, there shouldn't be any difference in the way that they treat you, because they're treating you based on what's supposed to work, right? Not dogma, not sort of historical experiences, but what actually works. And so you would have a physio, a myotherapist, a sports therapist, doing pretty much the same thing to get people back if they're following an evidence base. But at the point of graduation, there is some differences in terms of how people focus on different things.
Awesome, man. In your opinion, like with the types of patients that come through, where is BJJ on the scale of, like, how dangerous is BJJ? Is basketball worse? Is there a spectrum here that you kind of have in your mind?
AFL would be pretty bad too, yeah.
Yeah, look, definitely different injury profiles, different types of injuries, different, but also just like the prevalence, how often different things happen. We're a bit starved in jiu-jitsu. There's probably, in terms of like knowing these things. So a lot of what I talk about is probably just anecdotal, what I see coming through the clinic compared to other sports. So I was fortunate, I probably cut my teeth in rugby union. So I worked for 12 seasons in rugby union, sort of doing the pitch side, seeing a lot of that traumatic injuries, helping people then sort of back onto the field. And in jiu-jitsu, there's very unique injury profiles, like taking an LCL ligament on the outside of the knee. We very rarely see that in many other sports, because there's just rarely that there's pressure. We see more MCL. So if there's pressure on the outside of the leg pushing the knee inwards, then you get that MCL style injury. If it's the other way around, is LCL injury, where you kind of pressure on the inside of the knee gives you what's called a varus force, or just the knee rolling outwards, and things like that you don't see in the other sports. So because we're doing things like high pummeling from guard, and people are putting pressure down on the legs, or you've got things like lumberjack sweeps, all these just unique traits in the way that jiu-jitsu is as a sport that we don't really see, and the body's perhaps not naturally conditioned for. So we see mostly knee injuries, and from the limited bit of research that's out there, there's about 5 or 6 cross-sectional studies, which just means that we take a snapshot of time. We'll ask 100 people what injuries you've had over the last year or 18 months or whatever that is. And that research sort of shows that most of those show that knee is the most prevalent. And then it's kind of shoulder, then elbow, and then everything else is kind of falls by the wayside there. But it's definitely, I think the passion that people have for jiu-jitsu and gives, is probably linked to the injuries in the way that people don't take time off when they get little niggles. People, and not that you need to, but people don't even necessarily just change the way they're training when they get little niggles, and that tend to sort of, they can, build up and turn into things that perhaps they didn't need to, just because people don't like to change their training habits or take any sort of time away to focus on those things.
Sure.
Do you see people like that have kept training past the injury and made it worse? Is that a fairly common thing with jiu-jitsu practitioners?
Yes, yeah, I think so. We definitely, I think we've probably all experienced it yourself, and I wouldn't be immune to that myself in terms of doing that. I think you think things will just settle, and that's often the difficult conversation I have with people, is when I don't want to. Over treatment's a massive problem in healthcare. Like people, and we like any sort of practitioners often sell unnecessary treatments. Like I don't know. Bash chiropractors. I know a few great ones, but I will for a sec. Anyone that tells you need, 3 sessions a week for 3 weeks, 2 sessions a week for another 2 weeks, and then 1 session a week for the next 6 weeks after that, it's just selling unnecessary over treatment in these things. And people in jiu-jitsu do have great levels of self-efficacy in the fact that I think they have the ability to be able to manage things well, to work, to train around their injuries really well. Particularly the more experienced people, we know you've got a knee injury on the left side, right? We're going to play right side half guard or even left side half guard. You're not having to use that knee so much. And we have beautiful ways of being resilient and moving around, moving around those injuries. And I think, although early on there's a sort of, with a lack of understanding of the sport, and perhaps people might need a bit more help from people like me in terms of just do's and don'ts to do in the sport and how we can stay on the mats. There definitely is probably overall in the jiu-jitsu community a little bit of under recognition of things that we can do to either prevent injuries or at least stop things getting worse once they get better, once you're kind of continuing to train once you've been injured.
Yeah, you talked about like even you are not immune to kind of training in ways that you shouldn't. I'd love to know like from an insider's perspective here, when you like, have you had serious injuries? Have you kind of taken your own medicine, or have you completely ignored what you know to be like? I'd love to get on the inside of that a little bit.
Yeah,
willing to be open about it.
Look, I think in my younger days, I was definitely a lot worse for this. And yes, I had a lower back issue for many years. I used to do a bit of judo, landed on my back from like a makekomi, like an Uchimoto or makekomi, where the other player lands on top of you, and did a disc injury. I had some bilateral calf pain for about 5 or 6 years, and that's sort of on and off. And I know, looking back now, I would have managed things very differently in the way that I did that. I sort of pushed through, put it in that it'll be all right camp, and I ended up with about 8 or 9 years of sort of low back pain because of it. And more recently, I've moved past that, but that was definitely just a sort of immaturity of youth that set me back there. But I can probably give an example. I think I'm managing things better now, and we know that we're always much more prone to injury whenever we try something new, right? The biggest single reason that people get injured in jiu-jitsu is they're doing too much too soon after doing too little for too long. Right? A simple mantra summarizes our principles of progressive overload, when our reasons as to why we might get injured, when things are just new to us. And so for me, I've been taking up a bit more wrestling recently and training with a few other guys, as many people have. And at 38, I know I'm a little bit more susceptible to knees and just the roughness of wrestling, right? And just trying something new. So what I've been trying to do is, I suppose, not just do as I say, but also do as I do, and control some of those training variables that really help us to reduce injury risk and also just have more fun on the mats. So I've actually just posted this afternoon something about what sort of training variables that we can put in place. So everything from like how hard we might train. So because I picked something new, I know I can grapple at like 8, 9, 10 intensity and train pretty hard and stay safe because we have an efficiency of movement. We've been training for that long. The body has a really sport specific resilience, and I know that my body can handle those. Whereas when I go into something new like wrestling, even though you've got a martial arts background, there's still things that we just need to dial down a little bit, and that might just be the intensity of those sessions, or how often we do those sessions. Maybe picking the size of our training partners and stuff. So I generally tend to wrestle with people within about 15 kilos of me, particularly if I'm going to build up the intensity of those things, and then just sort of slowly moving from that kind of control to more of a sort of chaotic environment, and opening up more sort of ways of training that's a bit more challenging. So I've definitely struggled with that in the past, and just trying to push through, and it's made problems worse. But I'm definitely trying, like, now, to do things a bit different.
Brilliant, man. Brilliant.
Yeah. Would you say you'd see more white belts that are coming to you with injuries, or coloured belts, or is there no correlation?
I mean, I'm seeing every belt, I think, from white to black. I think, yeah, I don't think there's really a correlation there. Maybe the way that people have got injured is a little bit different. Yeah. We do tend to see, like you've got a spectrum of white belts, and if you have a look at the way that injuries happen, different body parts will happen in different ways. So you know that we've got these kind of like traditional overuse type of injuries, where knees get a little bit worn out over time. Meniscus is something, particularly lateral meniscus, is something we're seeing loads in jiu-jitsu, and that's kind of often like just a sort of recurrent sort of overuse over sort of slow degradation of that meniscal tissue inside the knee. Whereas you take something like elbow, and about 80% of elbow injuries are acute based injuries, because that's probably if you're not tapping from, those sorts of things.
You can even do that, Kim.
I was waiting.
So, like, tapping early and often is never. It's easy to say, but not easy to do, right? But just coming back to sort of the differences there, I think more the white belts, we see more of the acute style injuries. I posted out my arm and my shoulder went out, because the higher grades just wouldn't post into the same sort of silly ways. Or I tried to sit up from 50-50 guard and snap my LCL. Like, just the more experience we get, we see more of the sort of overuse style of injuries, and less of, so as the acute sudden kind of snap in general.
Yeah.
I love it. I was actually, Gerald Batty came to teach a community class the other night, and he had a really interesting theory about fingers. This is totally anecdotal. I'm not saying I don't know science in this area, but it was really interesting, because we did this kind of top game stuff, and we removed, like, we started off no arms, and we had our eyes closed, and then we did no arms, right, to try and pin people without arms, and then we did just arms but no hands. And the idea being that, like, in white belts, they use their grips and they use their hands for everything, but the more kind of advanced we get, the more we use kind of key pieces of our body and not the outer extremities and those sorts of things, so we get better at protecting things. And, like, it was just a fascinating kind of exercise to look at. And now I'm kind of interested in, do we use different parts of our body as we go through our journey, macro kind of movements versus micro, and putting things at risk, etc. So no,
I think you're really onto something there, Anton, because one of the things I talk about in injury prevention is around sort of skill development, and it does. So if we're using efficient technique and sort of sensible training habits, rather than sort of gripping onto things, we're using more frames, and you might be using more sort of like C-grip cupping hands rather than other types of gripping, which then, if we're using stronger parts of our body centrally in our core, then we're offloading some of the more the distal parts in your kind of elbows, shoulders and hands. And you can see that in some of the research when we say that, right, if we're looking at elbow like injuries, for example, if we have better strength and conditioning more sort of proximally up at the shoulder, then we can offload some of the stuff that's happening there. And I think those types of skill development definitely help you sort of in the long term in terms of preventing injuries.
Yeah, I love it, man. Awesome.
And what else, Tim? Like, you mentioned earlier about, like, dialing it back a bit for particularly newer practitioners. What other sort of things can people be doing to prevent the injuries that may come with jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, look, there's, if I go through like the principles of what I think are the most important levels. So the first thing is going to be always about how much total load that we're doing. And I'll talk about load management in a moment. Then it's the sort of outside of jiu-jitsu, developing athletic qualities, the strength and conditioning stuff. And then it's making sure that we're periodizing our training programs over time. So we can, if you're happy, we can delve into each one of those a little bit more detail.
Sure.
So
please.
first of all, like if I talk about load management, we're really talking about planning sort of our training habits to make sure that we're not doing this boom bust kind of workload patterns and coming back to that too much too soon after too little for too long. If we know that like if you can keep up a consistent moderate to high level of training, that's like our vaccine for injury prevention. I don't want to get into vaccines because this isn't
Get your COVID shoes here, everybody.
Probably another thing, but think of this like a really effective way. The most effective way for you to sort of prevent yourself getting injured is to keep up consistent training habits. Like that's just the number one thing. Like how many times have we knew the exact, I could tell coming back from COVID was a very busy time for me. Everyone coming back on the jiu-jitsu match after they've done like too little, right? Their bodies become deconditioned. They don't have the physical resilience in the ligaments and the tendons and the muscles, and they just go back and they think, oh, I can train at this intensity again, and bam, then we're at high risk, and there was loads of injuries happening. And you could tell the people that did the sneaky training sessions in the basement or in the garage all through COVID, and they kept that training habits. No, none of us, I'm sure, but they came out of that a lot better, because they had better long-term chronic moderate to high levels of training loads. So keeping up the consistency is number one thing. The next thing would be about sort of that athletic development and strength and conditioning. So we don't have any research in jiu-jitsu, but for pretty much every other sport, there's some good correlations between if you can stay a little bit stronger and have better neuromuscular quality. So that's all those different like athletic stuff. So a little bit of strength, flexibility, mobility, plyometrics, all that sort of stuff. If you can fit 2 to 3 supplementary training sessions, that's going to really pay off in terms of how much you can do on the mat. And for people that are like a majority of people listening that may be sort of hobbyists in the sport, I know that we can really overcomplicate strength training, and it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. It's really, if there's a movement that you want to get stronger at, you're completing 2 to 5 sets of that movement, about 6 to 15 repetitions with a 4-second sort of tempo, 2 seconds up, 2 seconds down, and you're selecting a weight that leaves you with about 1 to 3 reps in reserve. So you're working pretty hard, but you don't need to be maxing out, and then you're repeating that 2 to 3 times a week. So you take simple principles like that, and we can really reduce people's sort of ability to be able to tolerate all of your training stresses, all of your training on the mat, just sort of by a little bit of supplementary work. It's going to be diminishing returns after that, and it may be more related to like sports performance, and you might be better if you might get better at jiu-jitsu if you can do a couple more than that. But really for injury prevention, if we can just get a basic like level, that would be massive.
Interesting.
Then that's sort of, they're like the keys that I think of for sort of sports injury prevention and then like sparse and compression, all this. Like, there's so many little 1%ers. Wouldn't even be worth 1%. If you're not getting your basic load management right, you're not getting your sort of recovery right. And by recovery, I'm not talking about ice baths. I'm talking about sleep and nutrition and periodizing your training over time to make sure that every few weeks you have a deload week where you're sort of taking your intensity down. Like if you're not getting that stuff right, don't worry about all the other stuff, like, because they're just such a small, they just won't change the needle. They're just not a needle mover compared to these other things. So I think that probably, that's really the sort of main things there.
So as far as lowering the percentages, right? Like, and this could be the dumbest question anyone's ever asked you, right? But like, if knees are the highest percentage issue, right? Because I like to train jiu-jitsu 6 days a week. That's my goal. That's what I always usually do. I never change my intensity. It's always about 70 to 80%. Like I always tap early. I never get injured, very rarely. But if I was going to be preventative, would it literally be smart to just work knee strength and conditioning, right? Because that's the highest percentage. Does it make sense to do that and ignore the rest of my body? Like if I'm going to do nothing, is that better than anything? Is that better than nothing? Just to be honest.
Look, yes, essentially, if it's that or nothing, then I'd say that 100%. Okay. Right? Okay. But what I would say is that if knees are sort of 70% of the injuries, 60%, then that percentage of your time can be put towards that as opposed to the other areas. So I absolutely think lower limb, and we can we can either do very isolated, just knee strength stuff, or you can do more global training. Like if you do a deadlift or a squat, you're training, ankles, knees, and hips really. And so if you more sort of global work through the knee, as long as that was got like some strength stuff, some little bit of balance work in there, some hopping, some moving around, staying agile like that. I think that's going to be more bang for your buck than your upper body stuff. But it's always athlete specific. So if it should be dependent on your training history. If you've always had niggly shoulders, then that's where you need to prioritize a little bit more. It could be your genetics that is, going into that as much as anything else. So absolutely an individual approach, but thinking about your injury history or training history. But then also I like to always come back to what's the actual research saying. And for that, it's majority of kind of knees plus a little bit of sort of shoulders and maybe elbows is where you should be putting most of your injury prevention, strength and conditioning training in.
And what about, Tim, people who are time poor? Like you mentioned, you recommend strength and conditioning, say 2 or 3 times a week, but jiu-jitsu is really addictive. Yeah, it's fun. So if you've only got 6 sessions in a week, like Anton does, you give 3 of them to your strength and conditioning, then you only get 3 jiu-jitsu,
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. Like back in 2017, I was pre-children, I was studying a PhD, pre everything else, and I think training for Worlds, I was on the jiu-jitsu mat 6-7 days a week, and then extra strength and conditioning 5 and 6 days a week. But that's just not realistic for most people with lives. So those strength and conditioning sessions don't need to be any more than 20 minutes. So I don't think there's many people that can't turn up 25 minutes early to a class twice a week, get some strength and conditioning in, then go onto the mats. Like it doesn't need to be working maximally. You don't need to be completely fatigued. You don't need to kill yourself, but just getting some regular consistency done twice a week before a couple of your jiu-jitsu sessions. I think most people can fit that in if they're serious about trying to prevent injuries.
Okay, that's awesome. Because I've heard, you get various views, right? But I've heard that weight training before jiu-jitsu can have a negative impact, but I guess that just has a negative impact on the jiu-jitsu. I'm not sure. Is there?
Probably is going to be a little bit fatiguing for that. But I also we've got to take a pragmatic approach, right? We've got to, life is, everyone's busy, right? You've got lots going on. We're just trying to fit it in somewhere, and it's still definitely better than not.
Awesome.
And what about at the other end, after injury, and they've come and had some of the rehab, they've been doing it, how many people kind of re-injure an old injury because they didn't do enough rehab? Is that a common thing you see?
Two reasons, because they either didn't do enough rehab or they went back to full training too soon. So one of the things I put together a few years, maybe 18 months ago, was about a staged approach. So every other sport, there's quite a lot of research out there that says, right, when we're going to, it's a return to sport plan or return to training plan from when I want to first get on the mats to then getting back to return to sport and return to high performance. And at the moment, we don't really have any guide about how to do that. We just, if you go to a traditional physio sports therapist who doesn't necessarily understand jiu-jitsu, they'll get you through and they'll do a fantastic job at that first those first stages, and then it'll just say you're ready to go back to training. And there's such a jump up between what most people are doing in their rehab studios to what jiu-jitsu is, right? If you've got some crappy little exercise bands and you're using maybe you've progressed from a yellow band to a red band to a blue band or something like that, and then they say, oh, you're doing great, you're out of pain, you're ready to go back, you're in no way ready to go back to a high level of pre-injury training. And so for me, it was important to work out how I can support grapplers by getting a staged approach, I suppose. And I've called this a control to chaos continuum, and that's based on the work of Taberner, who's done it. He's used something similar in hamstrings, but I've kind of applied how we can do that from what's a really controlled environment to get people back early. So you can go back on the mat. With most injuries, you can be doing some technical independent drilling. So I talk to people about just moving around at home, you're just flow rolling. Even if people aren't confident, if they're white or blue belts, I say go and get that free Danaher solo drilling DVD that he put out during COVID. Now that just gets you moving around. It gets you to understand the positions of risk for you. It gets to understand how your body feels moving through different things. And then when you come back later on, when you start to maybe have some technical partner drilling, just slow and controlled. Then you move on to some flow rolling, which is kind of moderate level of control. And then you go on to sort of positional specific training. And then from there, maybe some technical standing drills and then some floor-based training. And then you've got your full sort of chaos, like full grappling, where you get scrambles and things like that. And we know that scrambles are going to be your highest risk. But what I like to do is get people as early as possible getting through those stages. So you may be still in rehab, still working through, you're not cleared but you'll always be cleared to do some technical independent drilling. Or if you're really not cleared for that, maybe you've just had an ACL surgery and you can't even do that for 2 weeks, then you've got some video content. There's always something you can do. And I've found that jiu-jitsu practitioners are so passionate and they love the sport that they just want to be able to do something. So I always want to offer people like a staged approach, and getting people back onto the mats, even just doing something simple like that. It takes some discipline. You've got to be disciplined to just, stay within those constraints. But if people have got discipline, we can get people back earlier, and that they're in a far better position by the time we get to that 7th stage of that control to chaos continuum, because they've built up the resilience again, not just in the specific tissue injury, but the whole of the rest of their body hasn't deconditioned because they're working around the injury. So I think the biggest thing for me in terms of re-injury is about getting people through a staged approach, stay disciplined to that's complementary to whatever the rehab program is.
Whenever I'm watching like MMA or Kim compete and there's a really serious injury, I've never had a serious injury, right? So I don't understand this, but Joe Rogan, for example, talks about how some of these people are just never the same again, right? It could be after concussion or a serious injury, hyperextended knee, whatever. Like, I'm wondering how many people really get back to as good as they were or better somehow in that area. Is that realistic? Is that something that can actually happen after a serious injury? Or is that just...
And I'm still in the room, hey? Remember that.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, kids. But I want to know if you as well as me. Will Kim ever compete again? That's what I'm trying to get to.
I've got a feeling she will.
Cool.
I don't know about that.
I believe. With the exception of spinal cord injuries, which I've seen in my time, I've never seen any single injury that people haven't managed to get back to full training. So every injury, there's absolutely hope and there's a good opportunity. But there's so many factors that go into that. It's a complex, it's a multifactorial kind of process. It depends on individual willingness and drive to get back to that. Sometimes, I'm not putting the blame on any individual. There's lots of sort of other things that can come into it. Other priorities change sometimes after injury, and people decide that they're not sort of wanting to put the focus in that area. But I've never seen any specific type of injury that people can't get back to full competing. Probably the worst of those are like a fully ruptured Achilles tendon or maybe even the ACLs. And I'm working with lots of ACL people these days, like telehealth all over the world and in Melbourne. And it's great to see people getting back either the surgical route or the non-surgical route. But absolutely, that would be one of the toughest ones psychologically, mentally. It's a hard road, but you can absolutely get back. And someone like Cooper, who's been sort of working with, he's the coach, absolutely. He's doing a fantastic job. Just caught up with him when he came back and visited a couple of weeks ago down in Melbourne to get some strength testing in the gym done and see where he's at. And he's progressing fantastically well down that surgical route. So if you've got that sort of commitment to the cause long term, absolutely you can come back from anything in my book.
Brilliant. That's awesome.
All right. There's still hope for me then. That's good. And Tim, so Black Belt Rehab, that's your handle on Instagram, yeah? And you put up lots of content talking about this sort of stuff and more?
Yeah, definitely. I actually just recently changed it from my name to like that Black Belt Rehab, just to make it a little bit sort of easier for people to find. And regularly just trying to do what I can to help the community, keep people on the mats. That's me now.
So, man, awesome. I'm just going to follow you right this very minute. Well, I mean, I probably already am, but I'm just making sure I am Black Belt Rehab.
Yeah.
Good man.
Awesome.
Any final words?
Yeah, we've got
any thoughts from Tim?
And you've got 2 minutes 42 for those final words. So
that no pressure on there. Look, there's so many places we could have gone with this conversation today around sort of managing acute injuries or anything else. But I would just say, just to recap those sort of principles of injury prevention, like if you can just find that little bit of time to just do a little bit of strength and conditioning, doesn't need to be complicated, doesn't need to be too hard, but just get some consistency in there, and it will pay dividends long term. If you're anything like me, or probably any of us really that see ourselves doing jiu-jitsu long into our old age, my kind of passion is to keep people being physically active, particularly in things that they love to do, like jiu-jitsu. So there's a few of these simple changes we can make, and it will keep you on the mats for many years to come.
Awesome, man. I feel like this was one of our more mature podcasts, man.
Very wise. It's funny because Tim's a real shit stirrer. Like, we probably didn't give him enough leeway to do any of that stuff.
You've got me more professional, more my professional mode today.
Professional. Really we'll have to have you on again another time, and we can see with the other side as well as the professional.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Great to chat with you.
Likewise.
Awesome. All right. We will have this out in a couple of weeks. If you could share it, that would really help us, and we'll share your page as well, so that hopefully we can, all help the community to just keep on rolling and keep on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've been listening to a few more of yours recently, and they're just, good fun conversational podcasts. Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of weeks before it will be out.
Yeah, that's it. We'll put it out, and then we'll tag you. We'll let you know, and
I'm flying out on Thursday to Craig's camp in Thailand for a couple of weeks. So
okay. Might have while you're over there. All right.
Anyway, maybe we should do another one while you're over there and learning from them. We just had, who did we have? We've got less than a minute. We'll talk about this offline. But it could be interesting to catch up while you're over there again. Anyway, we'll talk soon.
All right. See ya.
Cheers. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.